Hello, and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar with a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In this podcast, we interview scholars, thinkers, and writers from different disciplines, inviting them to discuss what interests them about utopias, dystopias, and speculative fiction.
Whether you're a student, scholar, or someone looking for reading recommendations, we hope you enjoy listening along. If you do, please let us know by rating and following the podcast wherever you are listening, leaving us a comment, or dropping us an email on utopiananddystopianfictions@gmail.com. So then, Matt, who did we speak to this time round?
Well, Liam, I had a great time chatting to Professor Jacqueline Dutton, Professor in French Studies at the University of Melbourne. Jacqueline has been a really important figure in utopian studies for a number of years, and this was an interview that I felt really spoke to our theme of interdisciplinarity. Jacqueline has a chapter in my edited collection, Wastelands and Wonderlands, Utopias and Dystopias in Film and Literature, which was just published earlier this month. So we'll talk a bit about that later in the introduction before we get to the interview. And in fact, Liam and I will tell you how you can win a copy of the collection.
Ooh.
Yes. Drum roll. But anyway, that's how I got to know Jacqueline and her brilliant research. In the collection, her chapter is titled Indigenizing the Critical Dystopia, Alexis Wright's Post-Apocalyptic Imaginaries in Carpentaria and the Swan Book. So we did spend some time, a fair amount of first half of the interview really talking about that chapter. Although it's worth noting that we weren't just talking about dystopia. In fact, much of what we had to discuss connected more explicitly with Indigenous utopias. I personally found the whole thing fascinating, not least because Jacqueline is a really engaging speaker and scholar, but also because her expertise really challenges sort of dominant, quote unquote, Western ways of thinking about categorizing utopia and dystopia. And as with all good interviews, I learned a lot. One of the striking ideas that came across is, at least for me, the idea that the very term utopia itself is a contentious one for Indigenous populations, largely because of its connection to colonialism. And what emerges is really a set of different ways of framing utopia for Indigenous peoples, like Indigenous Futurism, which we talked about a little bit. On the flip side, Indigenous populations have already lived through a form of apocalypse, i.e. colonialism. And so for them, they are already living in post-apocalyptic times, and we can learn from them how to live in such times ourselves in preparation for what seems to be, being, I suppose, a little bit bleak here, seems to be heading our way with the various intersecting crises that are on our horizon. The interview was incredibly varied, really reflecting Jacqueline's interdisciplinary research. So in the second half, we turned to her work on wine and utopia/dystopia, and to a discussion of French and Japanese cultural understandings of utopia. Jacqueline co-edited the 2019 collection Wine, Terroir, and Utopia, Making New Worlds. But there was a nice segue here. It doesn't sound as random as perhaps you might think. She talked a great deal in that about how the study of wine is really actually the study of place, specifically wine offering us a kind of taste of place. While there is again a dystopian and colonial history that accompanies wine, Jacqueline also identifies utopian desires as well, particularly in the way that wine promises to express the uniqueness and hopes of its place of origin. The interview concluded by exploring French and Japanese utopias, so really kind of reinforcing the central focus being this sort of discussion about what we can learn from different visions of utopia across different cultures.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I really loved the interview of Jacqueline. I think the sort of the best interviews, the best episodes that we have on the podcast are the ones that are like quite surprising, or like unexpected, or they sort of, as you sort of said, like teach you and I loads and loads of things, and I hope likewise for the audience. And I sort of remarked to you, before we started recording, that Jacqueline does this brilliant thing that I think the best scholars, the best academics, the best researchers are capable of doing, which is they can talk about and research and study things that seem really disparate and really like not connected in the slightest, and then find the through line that connects them. So, you know, we've, as you sort of summarise, you know, the interview discusses things as far-ranging as Indigenous futurism and you know, sort of what we can learn from Indigenous scholars to, as you say, sort of wine and utopia, or wine and dystopia, the sort of issues with utopia as a colonial sort of text. Then also, you know, the sort of differences between French or Francophone utopias and dystopias and Japanese, and then there's a bit about like intentional communities as well, and these things are all, you know, that's a lot of quite varied things, and yet there's this brilliant through line across all of it, and I just think it was deeply fascinating. I just really love that in this episode, you know, Indigenous visions of the future is something that I am totally ignorant about, you know, totally ignorant about. And I feel like I've learned so much. And I feel like what's interesting is that there's a strong eco-critical theme, preoccupation, it seems, in sort of these visions of the future from Indigenous authors. And that made me think back to our interview with Paul E. Hardisty, you know, on the hope. And, you know, although Paul is a Canadian author, he's now living in Australia. And again, there's a strong ecological or environmental preoccupation there too. And, you know, I'm just sort of starting to wonder if there's a pattern here about sort of the emphasis of the environment on texts from Australia, whether that is from Indigenous authors or not. Anyway, Matt, sorry, that was a small rambling from me. What sort of stood out for you from the interview, or what would you like to comment on, remark on?
Well, I mean, you know, like you, I really enjoyed the interview. I just had a great time chatting to Jacqueline. I already mentioned sort of that I'd had sort of pre-contact with her and worked with her a little bit on the edited collection. But as you say, she was just a really engaging speaker and was able to, as you say, thread some really interesting things together. But yeah, just going back to what you were saying there, this sort of idea of the sort of how different cultures view what we see as, I suppose, quite a fixed idea, or canonically a fixed idea of utopia. You know, this idea that we have batted around a bit on the podcast previously of the idea that utopia is a place that is both perfect and a place that therefore also must be static, which we pushed back on, I think, quite a bit, or I certainly pushed back on it as well in my own writing. But that actually in other cultures, you know, like, for example, Japanese culture, it might be literally the opposite. It might be, rather than static, it might be fleeting. Rather than perfect, it might be flawed. You know, that was really fascinating to me, because and I can absolutely see it in Japanese fiction. As you say, I think I mentioned in the interview that you know, I'd be teaching An Artist of the Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro, who is a British author, but, you know, obviously has Japanese background. And he's writing in that novel about Japan. He does an amazing thing to kind of capture that beauty. And there is a certain, I think that one of the reasons that Japanese fiction is so popular is because of that, its sense of kind of capturing beauty in its a particular moment, and that sort of fleeting nature of it is really part and parcel of what we like and about Japanese fiction. But anyway, I mean, you know, and here we are kind of having this sort of tangential discussion that's, I think, is really interesting, and is about, you know, a couple of minutes of the interview, because, as you say, there were so many things that we were touching on, and they all connected up, but as you said, there were just lots of interesting and different sort of pathways through it.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, we joke and remark often that the podcast is an exercise in developing our reading lists, let alone that of the audience. And, you know, I think there's a number of texts that Jacqueline mentions that are from Indigenous authors, and even from Indigenous scholars as well, that I really feel compelled to go and have a look at now. I feel like this episode in particular has really revealed my ignorance, and where I ought to be doing better. I think, where we write about utopias and dystopias from different cultures, I am often guilty of coming at that from obviously a very Western perspective and using Western critical thought or so on. And there's probably a huge critical and philosophical I don't know, sort of canon almost there from different cultures that maybe we ought to engage in. Otherwise, I suppose we run the risk of appropriating or even colonizing utopias and dystopias from other cultures.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Jacqueline was really emphasizing, and I think in her work is really good at, is embedding herself, I think, in that perspective, and not applying and appropriating, applying Western lenses to this inappropriately. We discussed that quite a bit in the interview, and I think her research method, if you like, as she sort of talks about it, is really striking and a really strong way of engaging with this kind of material. Because we are outsiders ultimately, no matter what we do. So I thought that was really good. I'm conscious, Liam, that it's a fairly substantial interview, and I don't really want to I don't want to detract from that too much. And we've got other things we wanted to get to as well briefly before we played that interview. So
what I wanted to say, Matt, it's remiss of me to not say it straight away. Congratulations, happy, slightly belated, but happy publication day. Tell us more about your book.
The press put an email to me saying happy book birthday or something like that. I thought we would say a little bit about this, and partly because it's actually so bound up in the origins of the podcast. The podcast certainly wouldn't exist if I hadn't been writing and working on this book, because certainly if we go back, the first 4 guests on the podcast were all contributors to the book. So really kind of mind that at the beginning as we were starting out, who do I kind of know? Since then, we've been really fortunate. Every time we've reached out to someone, they've said yes, which has been lovely. But at the beginning, a nervous Matt and Liam were kind of tapping up their contacts, and so that sort of came easy. But I thought if I could just say a little bit about it, and also as I said, talk about how you can win a copy of the book, because it is very expensive. Not you, Liam. You can't win one. That would be great. And I think the first thing I want to say really is a massive thank you to the people that are in the book, because I was so lucky to work with some amazing writers on this, including loads of writers who I really respected and who I had read as an undergraduate myself, and I was just super buzzed about being able to edit their work. It felt like almost like sacrilege that I was able to do that. But so every good book or every good collection really depends on the writers involved. And as I said, we had 4 guests at the beginning of the podcast: Raffaella Bacalini in episode 1, Daniel Vandel in episode 2, Sean Seeger episode 3, and Heather McKnight in episode 4, and they all have chapters in the collection. So if you enjoyed those interviews, then I think you'll enjoy reading their work in that collection. It's a really international collaboration with scholars working in 9 different countries. And I just say a little bit about the intro. If you're interested in the podcast, you might be interested in that, because the intro is really me grappling with personally what it means to be a utopian, whether I feel like I can call myself that or not, in some ways, maybe even about my inadequacies in terms of kind of living up to the ideals of what I think utopianists are or how they think, but also sort of how I've come to see utopianism primarily in the kind of outlook that I take to reading texts and writing criticism. And then I thought what I would do briefly as well is just share the contents page with you, just to give you a sense of what's in there, because there's so much really interesting stuff, and you'll see the variety of it. And I'll do it out of the copy on my desk, because that way you may do, depending on the quality of the mic, get a bit of book ASMR, right? Which is what you're really here for. I don't know. I'm going to intentionally flick the pages It's got that lovely crisp sound and smell. Anyway, so yeah, so the introduction is called Imagining an Exit. I've written that. The first chapter, the first part is about utopias on screen, so in film and TV as well. So the first chapter is by Stephen Rybin, wonderful American critic. It's on playfulness, utopia, and the fifth element. That's the movie, The Fifth Element. The second chapter is by friend of the podcast, Daniel Varndell, Heavenly Pictures, Utopian Thinking in the Anti-Utopian Cinema of Michael Haneke. And we talked about that quite extensively in the second episode of the podcast. Chapter 3, I don't see how singing and dancing could be dangerous. Becoming Utopian in Utopia Falls, interrogating a nano-utopian moment in young adult TV. So that's about a kind of a lesser known TV show called Utopia Falls, which is really interesting. And that's by Heather McKnight. There's chapter 4, Utopian Technology in the Mosquito Coast. That's both about the novel, but also about the film and Apple adaptation of the Mosquito Coast. That's written by Douglas McFarland. There's a wonderful chapter by a good friend of mine, Murray Pomerantz, wonderful scholar, professor in Toronto. The Utopian World of Technicolor. Honestly, it's a really fascinating piece about all the work that went into producing Technicolor films and how that work was in many ways utopian labor. And there's a sort of discussion about the connection between work and utopia, which is fascinating. Then there's a second part, which is about utopias on the page. So in primarily novels, but also short fiction. That section starts with Raffaella Bacalini's contribution called On the Nature of Utopia, a dialogue between Ursula K. Le Guin and N.K. Jemisin. So that's about the ones who walk away from Omelas, and N.K. Jemison's kind of riposte, the ones who stay and fight. There is then chapter 7, Utopianism and Imperialism. So an interesting one if you were interested in the material from the interview today. And that's in H.G. Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau and William Golding's Lord of the Flies, written by Hisashi Ozawa. And then there's chapter 8, which is Pessimistic Utopianism. That's the one by Sean Seeger, which we talked about a bit in episode 3 of the podcast. That part finishes with Utopia's Human Nature and Green Lifestyles by Werner Christie Matheson. So there's eco-criticism also in the book, and actually that piece, that chapter is quite a lot about Ernest Callenbach's novel Ecotopia and William Morris's News from Nowhere. I'm talking as if I know this book quite well. It's because I spent years looking at these chapters, editing them. It takes a long time to produce these books. The second half of the book then switches to thinking about dystopia. I've got a chapter in there on algorithmic satire and the end of social media utopianism in Dave Eggers' novels, The Circle and The Every. There's loads of sort of biting discussion of Twitter, or formerly Twitter, now X, which I've now departed from because it's just so vile. And that was really, I was writing that at the beginning of the kind of disintegration of Twitter, I think. But I'm also writing about literature and satire. There's Berku Kaiseki Akuyan, and I probably butchered her name, which was really embarrassing, who's written a chapter on Ishiguro's speculative fiction. It's called The Double Gesture of Non-Human Voices in Kazuo Ishiguro's speculative fiction. And she's writing in that chapter about Never Let Me Go and Clara and the Sun in particular. And then there's the chapter from this episode, which is Indigenizing the Critical Dystopia, Alexis Wright's Post-Apocalyptic Imaginaries in Carpentaria and the Swan Book by Jacqueline Dutton. There's a chapter by Patricia McManus as well that ends that section called, enticingly, The End of Dystopia. I'll let people go to that one and find out why it's about the end of dystopia, but it's a really great chapter. Part 4, Dystopias on Screen. So this is the final sort of run of chapters. There's a piece by Sean Redmond, who is a brilliant scholar who I definitely read as an undergrad and really kind of got me into his collection. Liquid Metal in particular was a great sort of science fiction edited collection that got me into writing, really. And his one is on Lonely Utopia, Lonesome Dystopia, The Crisis of Today and Tomorrow. And it features absolutely tons of films. So it's all about the kind of threaded theme of loneliness in dystopian film. Maria Varsam, another really great writer who appears in Raffaella Baccaglini's and Tom Moylan's Dark Horizons edited collection as well, has written on 4 Hollywood dystopian films and the connection between totality and totalitarianism in those films. Now I'm going to try desperately to remember what they are. It's been some time. It's Gattaca, there's The Truman Show, there's The Beach, and there's The Village. There you go. It wasn't too bad. Got them quite quickly. A former colleague of mine has Christina Wilkins wrote chapter 16, Hell is Empty and All the Devils Are Here, Space, Corporeality and Failed Utopia in Westworld. So that's about the Westworld TV show. And that's about the way in which utopia is something that we generally embody in some way. It's about the kind of bodily nature of utopia. And then Yelena Pataki Sumiga, who was very kind to invite me out to Croatia to speak at a conference. After this, has written a piece called Young Adult Dystopia's Influence on the Female Heroine in the TV series The Handmaid's Tale. So if you're interested in The Handmaid's Tale, it's primarily about the adaptation, but there's also stuff in there about the novel. And then the whole book finishes with Rebels with a Cause, Waste in Star Wars. Nicely rhyming title by Tom Yu and Callum McNutt. So a bit of Star Wars there to finish, a bit of popular culture to finish the book. So yeah, that ended up being really long, didn't it? Right, anyway. And I just wanted to notice a couple of things, really. I think one of the things that's worth noting is Suni did a great job with the production, so the collection looks amazing. But also that B, while it's obviously very expensive in hardback and really aimed at libraries, there's going to be a more affordable paperback version available in just about 6 months' time, which is really quick turnaround. And in the meantime, we wanted to offer listeners a chance to win a copy. We're going to announce the winner in the next episode, and I will post them dutifully, one of my author copies, out to them. I don't know if you want to introduce the competition, or shall I? I've made notes. We discussed how to do this extensively, Liam, didn't we? So
we did, yeah. I mean, I was stood up, so I wasn't making notes myself.
I've made some notes, so I think I've got it right. But you can correct me if I'm wrong. This is what we decided.
Yeah.
So we decided, first of all, that the competition closes on 17th of May. So please make sure you enter it by then, or else it's a wasted effort. Now I'm going to post on my own LinkedIn, that's Matthew Leggett, and I'm going to post on the Blue Sky account for the podcast, that's Utopian and Dystopian Fictions,
that's the
podcast at Blue Sky. Or you can enter by commenting on this particular episode on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. So here's what you got to do. You've either got to repost either the LinkedIn post, the Blue Sky post, or comment on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And you've got to comment your favorite episode of the podcast, why it's your favorite episode, and something that you've read as a recommendation from one of our episodes. You've also got to tag a friend who might be interested in the podcast. That would only be if you're on Blue Sky or LinkedIn, of course. So you can enter this 3 times. We'll put all the names in a hat, and we may put your name in 3 times if you want to do that. If you've entered 3 times, we'll put your name in 3 times. And we'll draw one, and I'll announce it at the beginning of the next episode. Yep. Hopefully, is that clear, Liam?
I think so, yeah. So to reiterate, folks, you have sort of 3 ways of entering the competition. That is either from reposting a post that Matt will put out on our Blue Sky account, or interacting with his LinkedIn post, or from commenting on this episode on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, whichever one you use. And then you have to do what Matt's just said there. So you have to explain or state which episode from podcast is your favorite, why it's your favorite, and something that you have read or maybe watched, listened to. You know, it's not just reading, because our lovely guests like to give us a variety of medium for information. So something that you've engaged with basically as a result of listening to the podcast. And then tagging a friend as well on LinkedIn or Blue Sky, because there is no tagging functionality, we found out earlier today, on Spotify or Apple Music. We say the 17th of May for deadline there, just because I'm always a stickler to put a time on that. So we'll say 23:59 p.m. Or UK time, whichever time.
I was going to say British Standard Time. We've got international people who, and I'm happy to send the book out. I'm not going to. It doesn't have to be UK. It could be US, Australia, or any country. We've got lots of different countries out there who listen to the podcast. So I'm happy to send it out. I'd be pleased to do that. One final thing, Liam, before we really want to get to Jacqueline's interview. And I feel like I'm doing a lot of kind of admin or whatever we might call it, or is that I've also been cheating on you, I'm afraid, Liam. I know people can't see your disgust, but I was a guest on another podcast. It's a great podcast on speculative fiction. It started around the same time we did, but has got more episodes because they've been super busy. And it's called A Meal of Thorns. And they deal in each episode with a critic discussing a particularly thorny speculative fiction text. Anyway, so it's their current episode coming out April 20th. Is an episode with me discussing Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. So if you're interested in that, if you haven't had enough of me talking, you can get a little bit more of it by listening to A Meal of Thorns. And it's a great podcast. Has also featured Andre Carrington, for example. So someone else we've had who's a great addition to our podcast. So there's a bit of a shared.
Yeah, there's lots of like cross pollination, or lots of mutual friends of the podcast. Well, Matt, of course, congratulations once again for book birthday. I know it's been a long process, but one that hopefully has been incredibly rewarding. And at the very least, it's brought some really interesting people to the podcast. There's some really excellent chapters within the book itself. Hopefully our competition rules are clear, and great news to hear that you've. Well, why should I celebrate you cheating on me? But great news that you've appeared on the other podcast. What I'll do is I will, as per usual, put links to all of the above in the episode description here. So our episode description will probably be much more thorough than normal. But in that, I will put in obviously a link to your book. I'll put in the sort of rules or requirements for podcast entry for the competition, and I will include a link as well to your appearance elsewhere. Is that on Spotify, Apple Music, all usual good?
All of the above, I think.
Yeah, amazing.
I think all of the above.
So I'll endeavour to get that out on there too. Matt, I'm aware that we have been we said before we'll make this concise, and then we've had lots to talk about. But I just wanted to express once again big thanks to Jacqueline for her insights and for appearing on the podcast. It's like a really phenomenal interview, one that I really enjoyed listening back to. But again, just to congratulate you on publication as well. It's big accomplishment, and I'm very happy for you.
Oh, thanks, Liam. Appreciate that. Let's get to the interview. Let's quit messing around. Let's get to it.
Let's roll that jingle.
I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Jacqueline Dutton. Jacqueline, could you introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Hi, thanks so much, Matt, for having me on the show. I'm professor in French studies, and French studies, of course, is less about teaching language and more about studying the cultural artifacts that we can access through understanding French language and culture. My research is very interdisciplinary, and whether I'm working on French cultural history, world literatures, cinemas, food and drink. I do quite a bit of work on gastronomy, travel writing, island studies, or speculative narratives. The connecting thread, or the red thread, if you like, through all of the areas of my research is utopia. So I have this kind of utopian goggles, I suppose, that are my lens upon which I gaze on the world. And really, I'm always looking for whether there is potential in a certain area to see it as utopian, possibly dystopian, critical dystopian, and apply some of those theories of utopia that I've been learning about and contributing to for about the last 30 years.
I don't know if you know this, Jacqueline, but we've themed this series, if you like, or this season. We've had some debate about whether it's a series or a season. I think we've landed on season around interdisciplinarity in utopian and dystopian fiction. So you're really sort of spot on, the perfect guest for this. I have to say as well, you're here, I suppose, slightly under false pretenses. You're mostly here as a way to advertise my latest book. I'm slightly kidding, but
oh, no.
it's actually out. We're speaking on the 1st of April, so I don't know when the audience is listening to this, or when we have a chance to put this out. But this happens to be publication day. Actually, kind of by accident, we were looking at times we could sit down and chat, and it's kind of difficult with the time difference. It's 6 p.m. or well, just after 6 for you, and it's 8 a.m. for me. But yeah, so it's publication day for Wastelands and Wonderlands, Utopias and Dystopias in Film and Literature, and Jacqueline is in the book. So I thought we would get together, we would talk about your chapter in particular. But as you sort of already laid out, there's a whole bunch of really interesting sort of crossover topics that I'm hoping we're going to get to later on in the interview. But so yeah, if you don't mind me starting with your chapter in the collection, then it's titled Indigenizing the Critical Dystopia, Alexis Wright's Post-Apocalyptic Imaginaries in Carpentaria and the Swan Book. So can I start by asking what drew you to writing about Indigenous dystopias in particular?
Congratulations, first of all, Matt, on the publication of this book. It's a delight to be a part of it, and very excited to get my copy once it arrives in Australia. I should have said also that I'm at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and Indigenous Australian literatures and cultures are very much part of what all of us are contemplating as part of our pedagogical responsibility, indigenizing the curriculum. And so I see the study of indigenized utopias as an opportunity to contribute to decolonizing pedagogies at the University of Melbourne, but also it's been part of my thinking about utopia probably for about 20 years, together with Lyman Tower Sargent, the granddaddy of utopian studies, as I like to call him, and a wonderful mentor to me, who's really encouraged me to continue my work on comparative utopianism. And so we were asking ourselves the question, would we recognize utopia in other cultures if we saw it, if we read it, if we experienced it? How does utopia differ in different cultures? Are there different paradigms? Are there different aesthetics? Are there different ways of imagining the ideal in different cultures? And so quite a while ago, I started working on this. I did a chapter for the Cambridge Companion to Utopian Literatures on this topic of non-Western utopian traditions. And as part of that, I was really looking at a fairly broad range. I really got out of my comfort zone, a broad range of different worldviews and the ways in which those different worldviews, foundational kind of golden age myths, influenced the ways in which utopian writing evolved in those cultures. At that stage, I did a little mention of Alexis Wright and Carpentaria in that chapter. And so that was, I suppose, the seed for thinking more about Indigenous utopias. And as it's become more and more part of our responsibility as educators at the University of Melbourne, I've worked with Alexis Wright, who was the Bois Bouvier Chair of Australian Literature at the University of Melbourne for 5 years, and been able to really explore the ideas of utopia and dystopia in her work. And I suppose that's really how I came to study indigenised utopias and the Indigenous ideas of utopia in this chapter.
Oh, brilliant. And for audience members who are unfamiliar with the fiction of Alexis Wright, maybe you could give us a little bit of a description of her writing. I mean, I certainly got a sense from, editing the chapter that there's something quite unique about it. Maybe what drew you particularly to her as a writer?
Great question. I think that, there is something really unique about Alexis Wright, and I'm so glad that came through in my chapter. She describes her writing as Aboriginal realism. We know the term magical realism or Latin American realism, African realism, but she describes her writing as Aboriginal realism, which means that to enjoy reading her work, you really need to let go of traditional Western norms of narrative and structure and linearity and temporality and embrace the creative opportunities that somehow arise between the writer and the reader. You might sometimes feel completely lost, but if you immerse yourself for long enough in her writing, the meaning will come through. So for me, reading her work for the first time actually reminded me of the kind of destabilizing experience of reading literature in French from Africa or the Caribbean or the Indian or Pacific Ocean. I'd learned French as a second language over many years, and theoretically I understood the language, but there were concepts and structures in these non-Franco-French books that I just had to go with the flow until they started to make sense in the context of the book. And so I feel like this was kind of a training for me to understand how to let go when you're reading something that doesn't correspond to the structures and norms that you're used to. I wonder if maybe it's actually easier to give up that hold on understanding everything when you're reading in a second or third language. Because you're already kind of displaced, and maybe that was a kind of training ground, as I said, for reading Alexis Wright's books. Funny thing is that I first read her books in France in the mid-90s. So a friend of mine had the Australian bookshop in Paris. Australia had just been announced in 1993 as the host country for the 2000 Olympic Games. So the Sydney 2000 Olympics had just been announced, and so everyone was interested in reading about Australia. And Alexis Wright's books were being translated into French, and so I read her first book in French translation when I was in France, which was pretty crazy. I think it was probably one of her most traditional narratives about women in the top end of Australia, in the Gulf of Carpentaria, called Plains of Promise, Les Plaines de l'Espoir in French. And from there, I kind of connected with her writing and learnt more about her, and read pretty much everything she's written from then on. I have this theory about Alexis Wright. I think she's actually going to win a Nobel Prize in Literature. We have one Australian Nobel Prize in Literature. It was won by Patrick White, an incredible novelist, in 1973. And I think it would be really great to go from Patrick White to Alexis Wright as our next Nobel Prize in Literature. I'm star spotting here. The author that I actually wrote my PhD thesis on, Jean-Marie Leclésio, won the Nobel Prize in 2008. So I kind of have a history of star spotting. I think Alexis Wright will be Australia's next Nobel Prize winner. There we go. You heard it first here.
Well, there's going to be a bunch of audience members going out there and betting on this now. Is this going to turn into some kind of betting scandal? Hopefully not. I love the personal stories there, Jacqueline. And yeah, I mean, you've already sort of talked quite a bit about this, I think, and we will come back to the apocalyptic angle, I think, a little bit later in the interview. But I think what you've already hinted at there is that actually a lot of the chapter has more to do with utopia than it does perhaps with dystopia, despite its kind of title. You know, I'm really interested in this, and one of the reasons I think, one of the many reasons for having you on the podcast is partly because I like to learn about this sort of stuff. So I like to have sort of interesting guests who are going to sort of take me a little bit outside of my comfort zone. And I have to say, you know, I really don't know an awful lot about sort of indigenous utopias, and I really feel like it's something I'd be interested in. So I wondered if you could just tell us about sort of the main, I suppose, the sort of bullet point list of sort of kind of things you learned during your research on this, about sort of indigenous utopias, you know, particularly anything that might sort of surprise us or sort of challenge our conventional ways of thinking about utopia.
Sure. Utopia is kind of a problematic term when we're talking about Indigenous thinking and Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous knowledges. Utopia is inherently stained by colonialism. Thomas More's Utopia is a colonial tale. It is about shushing those Indigenous habitants out and taking that place for their own, and not thinking twice about the people who had lived there before. Environmental damage, digging that trench between the island of Utopia and the mainland. It is inherently destructive. So consequently, Utopia is really, really problematic for any colonized people and, of course, Indigenous peoples. So there are some other terms that tend to be favoured by Indigenous scholars, and one of those terms is Indigenous Futurism. It's been theorised and written about a lot, especially by Anishinaabe scholar Grace Dillon, who wrote a book entitled Indigenous Futurism. And so I think that when we're talking about Indigenous utopias, we have to be very mindful of the potential damage that this kind of terminology or thinking can do in Indigenous contexts. It's really interesting talking to Alexis Wright about utopia, because she tends to talk more about dystopia, and I think that's also why I was focused on critical dystopia and indigenizing the critical dystopia in her work. Utopia just does have this ring of positivism about it that just doesn't fit with the Indigenous experience. And there are some Indigenous scholars with whom I've worked and communicated very well, and we understand each other, and they kind of like what I'm doing in terms of trying to deconstruct ideas of utopia, but they couldn't possibly actually consider utopia as a theoretical term in their own work. They need to have a new frame, which tends to be Indigenous futurism. So understanding that reticence is really important. That said, I do feel that utopianism, maybe more than utopia, so that utopian thinking has a lot to offer as a kind of bridge for people who are coming from non-Indigenous backgrounds to be thinking about how important Indigenous futurism is. and the idea of being able to imagine Indigenous futures is very, very important. And maybe utopian thinking, even though it's coming from a Western paradigm, is our best way of accessing and understanding Indigenous futurism. It's kind of controversial, but it's a theory at the moment that I'm exploring and testing with people.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, sort of problematizing, the roots and the origins of the term. I just find it kind of interesting talking to students about Utopia. I teach Moore's Utopia in sort of week 1 of our Utopian Dystopian Fictions module, and I suppose I kind of think, obviously, the dystopian aspect of Moore's writing is exactly what you say it is. There's a sort of imperialism implicit, explicit, in fact, in the text. It's not often the thing that sort of students' attention is drawn towards. I think they often kind of find problems with the lifestyle that's described rather than the kind of origin points, which I find, I suppose, I don't know. I don't mind so much the fact that they're all wearing the same clothes, for example, which I know is sort of the kind of thing that often students find oppressive in some way, etc. But as you say, I think there's something more troubling about sort of what underpins it. And I suppose the fact that it is an underpinning sort of logic to Utopia also speaks to the underpinning logics of sort of Western colonialism and colonial expansion that they're experiencing. So, yeah, I just want to sort of think about that in relation to dystopia a little bit, because you start the various sections of the chapter by quoting from Wright directly, and one of the quotes really sort of struck me as particularly interesting, which was, I'm quoting here: "By creating a dystopia," and this is Wright speaking here, "by creating a dystopia, we might understand Utopia better." I just wondered what you think she meant by that, and sort of as a way to sort of bridge into a discussion of dystopia in particular.
Yeah, it's always difficult to interpret what somebody has meant in their statement, but I can certainly contextualize it and offer some kind of reading based on reading the book to which she's referring. So she's referring here to the Swan Book, which is recognized as a work of dystopian fiction. She calls it a dystopia, and in America, I think it was called science fiction. In a lot of other cultures, and it's called climate fiction. So it's really a post-apocalyptic novel of climate catastrophe set in Australia, set mostly in the north of Australia where the damage is the worst. And the question that is posed in this novel is there any way back from this climate catastrophe? And I think writing this novel, writing the Swan Book, Alexis Wright tried to show us the dystopia of climate crisis in Australia so that we might understand how it could be different. Even though this novel also has an Aboriginal president in power, and this president is in constant consultation with Aboriginal elders, and there is this idea that Indigenous knowledges are empowered and attempting to remedy the situation, it is impossible to come back from this climate catastrophe. Too much damage has been done. The female protagonist in this novel's name is Oblivia Etheline, and she is the character who is portrayed at the beginning and the end of the novel. She is not the personification of hope by any stretch of the imagination, but she is the only figure to which we can look really for some kind of critique of the dystopia that is unfolding in this future Australia. So creating this dystopia, it is so repellent, it is so hopeless, it is so devastating for everybody that I think it's that reaching rock bottom so that we can understand how utopia could be thought of as part of a glimmer of hope in the future.
Mm. And you specifically, I suppose, I'm thinking about Australian contexts here, but you do note that many Indigenous scholars refer to our moment right now as post-apocalyptic, and I thought that was quite interesting. And that was again that sort of I'm slightly borrowing from you here because this is something we talked about prior to starting the recording, was this idea that the Indigenous populations already lived through a form of apocalypse, and so in that sense they are kind of best placed in order to teach us about how to deal with our impending kind of post-apocalyptic climate future, if you like. I wondered if you might say a little bit about that.
Sure. It's really a very prevalent trope in Indigenous speculative fiction, but also post-colonial speculative fiction. Any colonized culture has lived through the apocalypse. They have lost all of their structures, norms, language, hopes, dreams. Everything has been taken away and replaced by a completely different way of being, a completely different set of rules and structures that completely destabilizes everything they love and care for, whether it's environmental, whether it's human, relational, whether it's political, whether it's ideological. Everything has been stripped bare, as though it has been bombed in a nuclear holocaust. So, we might say that intellectual territory of apocalypse belongs to the colonized. They have lived they have historical lived experience of the apocalypse, and many theoreticians and historians have called this the apocalypse of settler colonialism. I'm thinking about the historian Gerald Horne, who has recently written a book about the apocalypse of settler colonialism. So these Indigenous fictions that project a post-apocalyptic future are actually speaking from lived experience. They have an epistemic advantage, if you like, because they have some knowledge of what it is like to lose everything and have to start again. So it's definitely a theme that we see a lot in Indigenous literatures set in Australia, in post-colonial literatures, as I said, but it's also something that we've seen a lot in Australia, because Australia was also a penal colony. So sometimes you see these penal colonies where people have been sent to make their lives anew. They have been given a second chance, but they have also had to live through a kind of apocalypse themselves because they've lost absolutely everything, their family, their culture, their connection to place. And, migrant cultures as well are also something that are also, cultures that have a touch of the post-apocalypse to them as well. Asylum seekers have had to remake their lives after a kind of an apocalyptic departure, a rupture from their way of being and living.
I suppose there's sort of the erasure of sort of personal history that you're talking about, but there's also a kind of in a lot of these cultures, I would imagine, a sort of a an erasure of kind of collective cultural histories, sort
Absolutely.
of schism, if you like, or a before and an after, and that before you've got to really sort of continue to try to hold on to that, because I suppose the longer the further away you get from that break, the more difficult it is to keep hold of that. I'm speculating here. I'm just sort of thinking about that situation. And obviously, you've talked a little bit about Australian contexts already, but I was also struck by in your chapter again the discussion of a particular region in Australia, which is actually called Utopia. And any particular insight you can give us about that place? What is that like there, and is it utopian in any way?
Well, this is probably a question that I can only answer from what I've read and seen as in sort of cultural products. I've never been there myself. It's quite remote. It's about 250 kilometers northeast of Alice Springs. Alice Springs is close to Uluru, the big red rock in the middle of Australia. And so it's quite remote. And it was named by German settlers who established a sheep station there in the 1920s on Illawarra and Amatjira lands. And these lands were reclaimed in some of the first successful land claims by Aboriginal people in the 1970s. So it became Aboriginal land, end of the 1970s, and they maintained the name Utopia. So the name Utopia is now associated with a very widely known Indigenous arts community that has had enormous success, that makes art in and from this country. So it's very much art of the place. And the most famous artist who came from Utopia region was Emily Kame Narawai. Emily Kame Narawai's exhibition has just been held at the Tate Modern, and it was the first Indigenous woman sold exhibition at the Tate Modern. And so the Utopia art community has got incredible acclaim throughout the world. It's all the place Utopia is also known by many Australians and perhaps internationally as well as being the subject of a film by John Pilger, the documentary filmmaker and journalist. He made a documentary in 2013 about this place that was an incredibly blistering critique of the Australian government for its shameful neglect of Aboriginal people living in this place in Utopia. So there's this, for a journalist, there's this perfect opposition, the name of Utopia for this place, and then the degraded kind of living conditions that he is filming of the Aboriginal people living there. Now, there's been a lot of critique of this film because the kinds of images that we have in this film are very much linked to Western ideas of recognition and intervention and Western models of education and living conditions and infrastructure and this kind of thing. And so the critique is based on these Western ideals, whereas Utopia has been studied, and because it was one of the first places in Australia where Aboriginal self-determination and land rights were recognised, it has actually developed as a very decentered kind of model of Aboriginal living called homelands. And so people are living in a kind of a dispersed way, and they are managing their own health, safety with Aboriginal consultation, and the longitudinal studies of health and well-being of people in Utopia are actually demonstrating higher success rates, lower morbidity, and therefore overall better health than a lot of Aboriginal communities that are being managed in a Western, alongside a Western kind of model. So it's a very complex model. How do we say whether this is a successful community or not? I think we don't necessarily take John Pilger's word for what is happening there in the eyes of the Aboriginal people who live there.
It's that desire to read everything through our own kind of lens again, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. I was so struck by this idea that we have a place in Australia called Utopia that I don't want to go there. But I wrote a little poem about it because I had this little poem as a kind of epigraph to my first real research work on Indigenous Utopianism. And can I read it? It's very short.
I was going to say, Jacqueline, if you weren't going to read it, it was a real tease. So I think you've now got to read it. I don't think we've got a choice.
Yeah,
this is where it's
short.
it's a 10-page poem now.
No, it's not an epic. It's not a novel in prose, in poetry, or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Love this idea. Go for it.
So it's just 6 lines. In the red heart of Australia, Utopia is a place. Though it bears a Western name, it is not a Western space, but a sign that social dreaming can have a different face.
Lovely, brilliant, and encapsulates the discussion we were having perfectly.
It's the kind of poetry that academics write. I put footnotes in if I could.
This brings me back to your other interests, I think. So, I'm conscious we focus quite a lot on this recent chapter, but your work in utopian writings and dystopia as well is varied, and in particular, I know you've written extensively about wine, and I'm particularly interested in this. I thought I was just piqued by this idea. Could you tell us a little bit more about the connection between wine, utopia, and dystopia? I'm also sort of it's not as disjunctive a topic of conversation as it sounds, because I gather from our conversation that it's also rooted in the idea of place. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. This really is an area that I'm putting a lot of energy into at the moment and getting a lot back from, I must say. So wine has been studied as a cultural object, and it's certainly probably the most culturally rich and widely studied alcoholic beverage in the world. And it has got a whole imaginary around it. It's got a lot of cultural production, textual, cinematic, and of course it is something that we enjoy drinking, many of us, not all of us, of course. So there are these sort of utopian potentialities of wine itself as a product, because it does have a whole imaginary around it. There's a lot of storytelling about wine, about the place that it comes from, and how it can make us feel as well, how it can provoke creativity, how intoxication can transform us for good or for evil. And so there's a utopian and dystopian aspect to wine in the way that it has been projected mainly in Western society, but is very widespread now across the world. Together with a group of colleagues, I put together an edited volume called Wine, Terroir and Utopia, Making New Worlds. And if you know about wine, it's a very colonial product as well. We have the old world and the new world wines. You might have heard those expressions before. New world. Australia is a new world wine producer. And of course, it's a colonial product. It has come, the grapevine has come to Australia from France, Italy, Spain, with the British colonists who saw this opportunity for finally becoming a wine producing empire. And there's some incredible research being done on wine as an imperial product, and how it has been promoted and marketed in that way as part of the New World. So the title of our book, Wine, Terroir, Utopia, Making New Worlds, was very much playing on those kinds of ideas. But we were struck by this idea that wine, terroir, and utopia are all words that are rooted in place, as you said, and in natural, spatial, and temporal realities. But none of them exist. None of them exist in a natural form. They are all brought into existence with purposeful human intervention. Wine does not happen on its own, despite what some people say. There needs to be a fermenting process and sometimes the addition of yeast, but there needs to be some kind of human intervention to make wine. Terroir is this French term for a sense of place, or sometimes a taste of place. So terroir is a term that we use to talk about wine where we can taste the place, whether it's Burgundy or whether it's Central Otago in New Zealand or whether it's a tiny plot of land in Tasmania. So this taste of place is translated by the term terroir. And terroir is an interesting concept that has been theorized very extensively. There are biophysical properties that determine why certain terroir produces a certain taste in the resulting wine. And there are also these kind of mythical, poetical qualities of terroir that include the historico-cultural interventions that humans make in cultivating that land, pruning those vines, and their hands and their ideas in actually making the wine. So it's very much this mix of nature and culture that come through in the concept of terroir. And certainly it is an ideal of winemakers to be able to translate the terroir in their wines. So there is this kind of utopian potential of the wine to translate the sense of place, the taste of place. And of course, utopia and dystopia in winemaking, there's the colonial aspect that I just mentioned, but there's also a sense of hope and a desire to make the best possible wine from the products that you have. And so utopia, wine, and terroir are all kind of interconnected as representing place, representing human intervention, human desire, human hope, and the ways in which we can make life better with good wine.
I very much hope that the research involved a reasonable amount of taste testing. You can tell me.
We call this sensory experience.
Right.
The sensory experiences of wine. Yes.
I think I've been writing about the wrong thing.
You're welcome to join us.
Yeah, I'm regretting all of my decisions.
Abroad.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Look, there's so much to be done on wine and culture, wine in literature, wine and representation, cultural representation. I welcome all comers, and I'll give you a reading list, no problem.
I'm more of a beer drinker, Jacqueline. So I think, but something similar. I mean, beer has become similar in a lot of ways, right? That there's so much sort of micro brewing and stuff like that. So perhaps perhaps the next thing is going to be beer and utopia. I don't know if you've there's a company, I'm guessing it's a glass company that makes glasses called Utopia. I don't know if you've come across that in Australia, but we have it in the UK. I've often got like a glass, and it says, it's like a water print or whatever, it says Utopia on it. And I have been known to take the odd sort of photo of a beer in my glass, and it says Utopia on it on a kind of Friday afternoon. So yeah, there's something in that. Brilliant.
Is the caption still at work? Still at
Oh.
work with my Utopian beer? That should be your caption, maybe.
Well, you're still at work, and we're nearly 7 p.m. But you've resisted. You've got water in front of you, which I was a little bit disappointed by, if I'm honest. I was hoping you'd be demonstrating the research with a glass of wine, and you'd be entitled to it at that time in the evening. So yeah, just I suppose finishing up with this idea of place a little bit more, which is sort of run throughout our conversation. And maybe this is a bit broad, I don't know, but I know that you also write about French and Japanese literature, and I just wondered if you might say a little bit about the sort of different visions of utopia and dystopia across these very varied cultures. You know, is there something we can learn about utopia and or dystopia from the differences that you've sort of seen as you're studying across these cultures?
Sure, this is a topic very dear to my heart. I think this French and Japanese comparison was kind of what got me launched in this idea of intercultural imaginaries of the ideal. And I was looking at the 19th century cross-cultural pollination between French and Japanese art, and the way that the French Impressionists were borrowing from the Japanese woodblock prints, the ukiyo, U-K-I-Y-O. It's a short word that begins with U, and it just so happens that it is kind of like the Japanese parallel to utopia. Ukiyo is the word for the floating world. It is an idea of impermanence. It is an ideal. And I started digging and thinking, okay, this is completely different from the idea of utopia, which is not floating, which is not impermanent. It's the idea of locking something in an ideal society that will be good for everybody all the time and maybe last forever. This is the more traditional Western classical utopian thought. So I started looking at French utopias because this was, you know, my field of research, my home turf, if you like, and looking at French utopias as classical Western Judeo-Christian models and the kinds of tropes that the norms that they expressed: order, regularity, symmetry, light, transparency, and longevity or permanence. These are the kinds of ideals that we see expressed in the aesthetics of Western utopias, especially French utopias. I'm thinking 19th century French Fourierist ideals and Cabet and these kinds of writers of the 19th century. And then I started looking at the ideal aesthetic in Japanese literature and culture. You may have heard of wabi-sabi. Wabi-sabi is the honouring of the asymmetrical, or the honouring of the flaw in the beautiful object. It's like that beautiful ceramic vase made from beautiful Japanese pottery, and if there is a crack in it, it will be mended with gold leaf to make that flaw more visible and to make that flaw into a feature. So the Japanese aesthetic is not about sort of this perfect order. It's very much about recognizing the flaw and making it part of the whole. So asymmetry is something that is always part of a positive aesthetic. You don't have sets of 2 or 4 or 6, the symmetry. You have a set of 5. You have a set of 3. If we're talking about dishes or or other items in the home. So asymmetry is very important. Instead of light, instead of privileging light, there is a privileging of shadows in Japanese aesthetics. If you think about those beautiful rice paper screens that you see in houses, the idea of the shadow against the screen is part of the aesthetic appreciation of the room. Murakami, Haruki Murakami's world famous novels, there are shadows everywhere. There are philosophical books written in Japanese in the 19th, 20th century in praise of shadows. This idea is anathema to the West, where the shadow represents bad, evil, the other, something that you don't want to privilege. So we've got this completely different aesthetic. And then we've got the idea of the beauty in the ephemeral, the floating world, the ukiyo, mutability and ambiguity, impermanence. You think about cherry blossom viewing. Cherry blossom viewing is about the beauty of the moment. It will go, and that is why it is beautiful. So this whole aesthetic that comes from Japanese sort of a religious worldview and an aesthetic worldview that honors mutability and ambiguity above order and permanence influences inherently the way that the Japanese then adopt ideas of utopia into their culture. I actually went and stayed in a utopian community in Japan. It's still going, Atarashikimura, new village, and it's been going for over 100 years, and it's a community of artists. And I was expecting to arrive there and there be sort of communal dinners and wonderful conversations and you know, sharing of aesthetic ideas, and I got there and there was no communal anything, not meals, not meetings, not sharing of work, no studios. It was incredibly fragmented kind of society. And I started processing it and reading more about it, and I found that it was completely in keeping with the idea of an intentional community, because normal Japanese life is much more communal and together and ordered, and everyone is obliged to work together, than it is in Western community. Western community, we have sort of an individualized approach. Independence is what we strive for in Western community nowadays, whereas Japanese society is a lot more together and communally oriented. Therefore, their ideal to get out of that community is going to be about being on their own and being fragmented. Whereas in Western society, our intentional communities are very much about meetings, communities, communal meals, and being together. So there's just this complete flip side that comes from a very different worldview in the Western, French, and Japanese utopian visions.
I really love that discussion there, Jacqueline, and you're going to make this episode very hard to badge. I'm not sure what words we're going to put in our description for this, because this is very wide ranging. I've got a cherry blossom tree in my garden. It's currently out, although it's just as you said, it's very fleeting. I mean, it's like 2 weeks of absolute stunning beauty, and then it's gone. You know, so it's currently growing its leaves, and there's a couple of bits of blossom left, but most it's all over the garden. But yeah, it's a fabulous tree. I also, I don't know if you come across it, and I don't want any of the audience writing in and saying it's a British author, because I am aware that Kazuo Ishiguro is a British author, but I don't know if you've read An Artist of the Floating World.
Absolutely.
What a wonderful novel that is. I actually taught it for quite a few years at university, and yeah, beautiful novel. So yeah, that's all, and that conversation I think will help me if I teach it again in future. Will help me sort of get my head around it a little bit more. So thanks for that. Well, we're getting towards the end of the interview now, so could I ask? I mean, you've already talked about some of the fabulous things you've been working on. Are you working on anything interesting at the moment, at present?
Well, well, I think it's interesting. It's keeping me up at night. I'm looking at, I've talked about how I've looked at French, Japanese, Indigenous, Australian. I'm now looking at a lot more at Caribbean, Francophone worldviews, Afrofuturism in the Caribbean, and also what's happening in contemporary African philosophy around utopia. So in French and Francophone studies, of course, we're trying to decolonize our curriculum. And what I've really noticed is that when we try and decolonize our curriculum, we tend to use the work of non-Indigenous scholars to try and, or non-Francophone scholars perhaps, to try and deconstruct what we're doing. And maybe we should be looking at what the African and Caribbean theorists and philosophers are actually doing and what they're doing with utopian thinking. So I've, there's a sort of a lineage of utopian thinking in Martinique, Edouard Glissant, Patrick Chamoiseau. Patrick Chamoiseau is actually a big influence on Alexis Wright, so that's a really interesting parallel there, and Michael Roch. So there's these 3 generations of Martinican male writers who are all working on utopianism and writing about utopianism. So there is this kind of body of thinking that we can actually use to decolonize the way we're approaching global French studies. From Africa, Achille Mbembe and Felwyn Sarr have been running these incredible workshops in Dakar, in Senegal, and they are called sort of thinking workshops, and they are using themes like utopianism and Afrotopias to try and think about how African knowledges could be valued in a different kind of African paradigm. So I find this really exciting. This actually does keep me up at night. And I kind of think, how am I going to get into one of those workshops? I don't think I'm allowed because I'm not part of the African diaspora. But it's really, really interesting because it is about rethinking the way utopia can be used in a very post-colonial context. So that's something I'm writing about at the moment. I've written one article in French and one in English on that. And I have more to say. I'm going to Martinique quite soon, so I'll definitely have more to say after going there and hopefully talking to some of these people.
It strikes me, Jacqueline, that your work demonstrates, I suppose, the inadequacy of the traditional academic paradigm where research is very much, located in one specific place, and you become the expert in that one thing. And I think just from editing your work in the collection, what struck me was your approach to your very thorough approach to dealing with scholars in Indigenous communities. And that's a skill that you can sort of transpose, I suppose, across different cultures and different communities in a way. So I kind of feel like, what you're saying demonstrates that it's more about a sort of a cultivated research practice that you have generated, if you like, for going into these sort of different communities and sort of understanding them in a way that's not you're in dialogue with them rather than sort of coming from outside to impose your own kind of Western reading strategies, if you like, on what they do. So I think you're demonstrating just how much work I think goes into that kind of, or should go into that kind of scholarship. It sounds fantastic. As a sign off, we always ask our guests to tell our audience of a text, could be novel, film, piece of criticism. Your own work excluded, of course. People should go out and read that. We'll put some links as well in the description. But yeah, something you think everyone should read, ideally something useful for an engagement with Indigenous utopias or dystopias might be appropriate. What would you recommend?
I have two titles, if I may. Two collections of First Nations Indigenous speculative fiction from Australia. The first one is called This All Come Back Now, an anthology of First Nations speculative fiction edited by Michaela Saunders. And she's doing some fantastic work on, she's writing speculative fiction herself, but she's also done a PhD on speculative fiction, and she is definitely one to watch. What I love about both of these recommendations is you get this kind of sampling, if you like, a sample of a lot of different Indigenous writers from Australia in that volume. And then the other volume is called Unlimited Futures, Speculative Visionary Black with a K, which means Indigenous Australian, plus Black with a CK, which means migrant, African, other Black communities writing fiction in Australia. That's edited by Rafif Ismail and Ellen van Neven, and that gives you a little bit of a broader, sort of migrant writing and Indigenous writing, but held together by this idea of Black fictions in Australia. I actually, when I was teaching this subject, where I was trying to encourage 2,500 commencing arts students per year to get into utopian thinking. It was called New Futures, this foundational course that I had going for 2,500 students a year. I asked them to read one of the short stories from that second volume, Unlimited Futures. It's called 15 Days on Mars by Amberlynn Quamelina. It takes you about 15 minutes to read. It's got nothing to do with Mars, but it's got everything to do with Mars, and it might just change the way you see the world. I strongly recommend it. 15 Days on Mars, Amberlynn Quamelina. You might even be able to find it online. But both of those volumes will give you incredible overview of the rich diversity of speculative fiction coming out of Australia with Indigenous authors.
You're speaking the kind of music I like to hear. 15-minute reads. That's perfect. Brilliant. Thank you, Jacqueline. And no one can see this, but you've been plunged into darkness. I don't know if that's telling us that you should be going to bed now. It's late on your end. So I'll take that as a hint. But thank you so much. You've been a wonderful guest, and I found that fascinating. So brilliant. And I hope we can keep in touch and catch up soon.
Thanks, Matt. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that we work together again in the future.
Once again, we'd like to say a big thank you to Jacqueline for coming onto the podcast. Between Indigenous Futurism, the relationship between Utopia and wine, and how Utopianism differs across different cultural imaginaries, we really learnt a lot, and hope that you have too. Congratulations to Matt on the publication of Wastelands and Wonderlands. If you would like to win a copy of his book, don't forget to take part in our competition, details for which are in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating and following the podcast, writing a comment, or sending us an email on utopian and dystopian fictions@gmail.com. And, as ever, don't forget to join us next time, where we will delve into some more utopian and dystopian fictions.